clever thing to do is to always predict a disaster. Why? Because if a disaster does happen, all of you would conclude that I have superior insight into the economic process. And if a disaster does not happen, all of you would be very impressed with how much influence I have on policymakers, such that they have taken timely preemptive actions. So, but in this audience, I know that it would be better to try to be correct than rather to be clever. So my talk today will consist of trying to answer 3 questions. The first question is, what is the state of the world likely to be in the next 12 months? Question 1. Question 2, what kind of economic policies are likely to be implemented in the major countries of the world in response to the economic situation I talked about in the first question? And the third question is, what could be done to restore high growth in Malaysia, given the external trends and foreign economic policies that will be implemented? Okay. On the first question, how is the world likely to look like? On the aggregate level, world output was predicted to grow around 4.4% by the International Monetary Fund in April 2011. But 2 months later, the IMF revised that prediction down from 4.4 to 4.3%. The reason why the IMF predicted a further slowdown of the world economy in 2011 is because the major economies of the world have slowed down much more than what the IMF expected. Specifically, the United States was expected to grow 2.8% this year, according to the IMF in April 2011. 2 months later, the IMF revised it down from 2.8 to 2.5. And at the same time in April 2011, the IMF predicted Japan would grow 1.4% this year. But 2 months later, after the earthquake, the IMF has predicted that Japan would grow minus 0.7% this year. So it looks like the major economies are in trouble. But this is not seen in the emerging developing economies. Specifically, China is expected to grow around 9.6% this year, after growing 10.3% last year. And in fact, what we see is that for the developing world, the economic growth rate would actually go up from 6.5 to 6.6. So we have a world where what we see is the most developed and the richest countries are declining in the rate of growth, whereas the developing economies are accelerating in their growth. What's the implication for Malaysia? Because the large rich economies comprise of the bulk of the world economy, what happens is, since the greater proportion of the world economy is slowing down compared with the developing economies, the overall growth rate slows down. That means that Malaysian exports are unlikely to be higher this year than last year. Second implication, is that of whatever Malaysia export, a greater proportion of it would be going to India and China and Brazil, and less of the proportion to Western Europe and North America and Japan. And what does that mean for Malaysian GNP growth? It is expected, now the IMF expects Malaysia to grow by 5.5% this year, to grow 5.2% next year, to grow 5.1% in the year after that, that is 2013, and continues to slow down until Malaysia will grow at 5% in 2015. This is what the IMF is predicting. However, to jump ahead to the punchline of what I'm going to say, I would say we would grow at 5% if economic policies in Malaysia remain unchanged, and if the government of the day continues the present economic policies. I think that the outcome will partly be a reflection of what's happening outside of Malaysia, but more importantly, the final outcome will be determined by the kind of economic policies that will be implemented in this country over the next 5 years. Let me come to question 2, which is what kind of economic policies are we likely to see in the major economies of the world? We all know that in September 2008, Lehman Brothers imploded, and financial markets around the world melted. That caused a contraction of credit globally, which then produced the sharp contraction in output in 2009. And given that the response that the United States undertook was to expand government spending and increase the amount of credit in the banking system. This is traditional macroeconomic stimulus. The question is it likely to work? What's wrong with the stimulus policy is that they were trying to recreate the situation that existed before September 2008. But the period before September 2008 was a period of asset bubbles. So how could you hope to attain sustainable growth if the goal of the policy is to reproduce the situation before September 2008? Let us ask ourselves, why did the bubble happen in the United States? I think the bubble has its origin in the United States government not recognizing what its true economic challenge was. The true economic challenge of the United States that the United States faced was the challenge of globalization. And what is globalization? It is effectively the integration of 3 groups of countries into the world economic system. We all know what globalization means: increased interdependence among economies. And if we were to go back and ask what were the developments that led to the greatest jump in the degree of interdependence, I would say historians would look back and say that the biggest jump forward in globalization occurred in the period 1990 to 1992. What is unusual about 1990 to 1992? On January 1st, 1990 was the day that pollen